The first half of life is to build a robust container, whilst the pathway through the second half of life is to experience for itself the contents of the container. In the first half of life, we are homed, we are schooled, we move out into a world and a culture and a time frame in history that we navigate, and we do as much as possible in order to stamp meaning, definition, purpose towards our achieved goal of finding happiness. And we find out what works for us and what doesn't, and we are dealt some bitter blows seemingly by life itself as we experience for the first time loss, emptiness, brokenness and struggles as our plans aren't met, and as life navigates its own direction, that opposite or different to the direction we would like to go in. Ultimately, we find that all of this belongs and all of this creates a significant way of being that we can live out of that prepares us for the second half of life. Somewhere between the ages of 35 and 55, the usual human archetypal pattern illustrates very well that we begin to experience, most of us begin to experience difficulties and struggles as our resources, our tools for the first half of life begin to disappoint, begin to let us down, begin to fail, begin to not work. They're not adequate to bring us through experiences of things like loss and grief so that we can adequately know what to do with them. Perhaps someone dies. Most of us will experience the death of our elders, somewhere in that window, 35 to 55. Or maybe we've developed earlier on mechanisms and strategies and coping concepts in order to bring us through periods of difficulties. Maybe some of us use drugs and medicines or drink or eat or change relationships when we encounter difficulties. And we hit a significant loss, our image of ourselves, a parent or a grandparent, or maybe our marriage fails or our primary relationship fails. We may experience the loss of a child, or we may experience cataclysmic illness. Maybe we given a finite diagnosis. And our mechanisms that we've earlier used begin to not work on this particular situation through this thing I'm going through. Were you to look around recovery communities, or were you to look at the details of the individuals that begin to seek therapy, counselling, or appear at the general practitioners, at the GPs, talking about depressive states and low mood states and anxiety and depression, and seek prescribed medications and such, or people that want to change their lives or find a new career or are going through so-called midlife crises, sometimes seemingly too early. You would see mostly males, but not exclusively, of course, but you would see a lot of males in accessing such support. You would find in a lot of women's groups, of course, you would find a lot of women, as they do in community, reaching out to each other, talking to each other, struggling. Maybe their children are growing up and don't need them so much. So our primary roles are challenged, our identity and our functionality and who we thought we were in the world begins to change shape. We begin to be taken out of life as we knew it, as we know it, as we perceive it, as we would have it, and into life as it is. Now, of course, it's a hugely transformative experience, but many of us struggle around this period to either allow ourselves to be taken by the experiences we're going through. Maybe we lose a parent, for example. Let's just take one example. We lose a parent and we don't know what to do with this. There's no coping strategy or mechanism for doing this. Maybe we know a little about grief and how that goes. Maybe we know a lot about grief and the pathway that takes. But whatever it is we think that we know isn't adequate to deal with this very experience of it, because this time we are really struggling with what we're going through. And of course, we are being called into a greater picture. We are being called towards the experience of the contents of the container. And our regular strategy has failed. Many of us will find at such times that life is asking us larger questions than we're used to. We begin to reevaluate the meaning of life, perhaps. We begin to look beyond our usual mechanisms to enable ourselves to be taken to something greater. As contemplative Richard Ross says, if we do not transform our pain, or I would say, if we are not transformed by our pain, we will transmit it. So how many angry people do we see that are trapped at this juncture in life? Maybe they're much older, 10, 20, 30 years older, or they die elderly, still with untransformed pain, still trapped in the ideas and perceptions and the consciousness of the significant life event they went through, the collapse of the ego, the brokenness of the programs for the first half of life as they fail. Many people can stay trapped there forever. See here addictions to alcohol, food, sex, spending, codependent relationships, substance misuse. We either become trapped in those old patterns or we are transformed beyond those old patterns into a bigger picture, a bigger story, a bigger mind. And there are many ways of this happening for us. As we've said, whether it's therapeutic, whether it's spiritual, maybe people go off and join different groups or classes or become involved in some kind of community or larger peer group outside the peer group of the primary family and that's function, and become involved in a greater project, something that maybe is more community based but then still impacts upon them independently, personally. We just become involved in a larger story, and then we find other ways of seeing things, other perspectives for how we can navigate this experience that's transforming us. You'll see many elderly people that have been taken through life's necessary suffering, life's inevitable suffering, and necessary and inevitable this type of suffering is. When you find humble, elderly, wise, seemingly happy and content people, using those words loosely because there are always fluid states at whatever age, but the real fluidity and wisdom around being happy is knowing, integrating and embodying a sense of unhappiness when it's there, knowing that even the unhappiness belongs to something good. This is the fundamental lesson that comes out of going through this transformational process in midlife, where we have been able to be transformed by it. We find we are around people that are able to hold the tension of suffering and hold difficulty and hold struggle and even hold ideas about their own mortality, our own mortality, my own mortality, and be able to carry the tension of that to a greater or lesser degree on any given day and know that once more it belongs to something good. As it's been said, to learn how to do life well is to finally come to a place where we learn how to do death well. And so truly we are in a transformed consciousness. Of course, there's so many people that aren't transformed in such a way that do end up lonely and unhappy and trapped in patterns of cycles and states and places and experiences and brokenness and suffering. And of course, we become very mean-spirited in these places and we become quite difficult to be around. I'm sure we've all encountered people like this. I'm sure we've all met people and know people very dear to us that can be like this. Or perhaps if we're truly suffering, we are like this, and that might be maybe why we're listening to a talk such as this. But in the end, it all belongs to something good, and it's all part of our search for meaning. Ultimately, out off the back of this, we find in wisdom circles and in wisdom teaching that the meaning that we give to things is something that we individually apply according to how we experience our life and experience our place in the world. We started out as children and from home with the schooling and the teaching of all that influenced us at the time. We looked out at the world through our senses. We saw the things we saw. We know the things we know. We insist on the things we insist on, and the things we insist on then collapse, and we realize the very opposite was true. And we come to a place where we know that we don't really know. The one thing that we do know is that we're not really sure what we know. And so it all becomes this wonderful, open-ended, free, spirited, loving offering. And as much as we're able to offer that out, are we able to receive it? Then we've truly become a reconciled person as we've reconciled all of the opposites in our life. The first half of life with the second half of life, our happiness with our sadness, our joy and our pain, our sorrow and our ecstasy.